The winding mountain road stretched before the Blackwood brothers like a serpent, its asphalt scales glistening under the setting sun. Thomas, the younger of the two, gripped the steering wheel of his sleek sports car, knuckles white with tension. In the passenger seat, his elder brother Michael stared out the window, his face a mask of stoic indifference. "You're taking these turns too fast, Tom," Michael said, his voice barely audible over the purr of the engine. Thomas eased off the accelerator slightly. "Sorry, Mike. I guess I got carried away with the thrill of the drive." The brothers' relationship had always been complex, a mixture of admiration and unspoken competition. As the firstborn, Michael had inherited their father's company, Blackwood Industries, while Thomas worked his way up through the ranks. Despite the potential for resentment, they had managed to maintain a cordial, if somewhat distant, relationship. As they rounded another bend, Thomas felt the car's tires lose traction. His eyes widened in alarm as he wrestled with the steering wheel. "Mike, hold on!" The vehicle fishtailed violently, skidding towards the guardrail. Thomas fought to regain control, but it was too late. With a sickening crunch, the car smashed through the barrier, launching into the abyss beyond. Time seemed to slow as they plummeted. The world outside the windows became a blur of earth and sky. Thomas's last conscious thought was of his brother beside him, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared terror before everything went black. When Thomas awoke, he was in a hospital bed, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of disinfectant and the steady beep of monitors. A nurse stood over him, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Blackwood, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Thomas blinked, struggling to focus. What happened? Where's Michael?" The nurse's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. Your brother, he didn't survive the crash." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Michael was dead. As the reality began to sink in, a wave of nausea washed over him. Memories of the accident flashed through his mind. The loss of control, the terrifying freefall, the final look of fear in Michael's eyes. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, it can't be. There must be some mistake." But deep down, Thomas knew it was true. His brother was gone, taken in a split second by a twist of fate on that treacherous mountain road. As he lay there, staring at the stark white ceiling, Thomas Blackwood had no idea of the trials that awaited him. The company he had worked so hard to prove himself in would soon be his to lead, but at what cost? And little did he know that the greatest challenges to his newfound position were yet to come, born from the very tragedy that had thrust him into power. The nurse left him alone with his thoughts, and in the quiet of the hospital room, Thomas began to weep. He wept for the brother he had lost, for the future they would never share, and for the weight of responsibility that now rested solely on his shoulders. As the first rays of dawn crept through the hospital window, Thomas made a silent vow. He would honor Michael's memory by leading Blackwood Industries to even greater heights. It was what his brother would have wanted, he told himself. 6 months after the tragic accident, Thomas Blackwood stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, gazing out at the city skyline. The view from the top of Blackwood Tower was breathtaking, but Thomas hardly noticed it anymore. His attention was focused on the reflection in the glass, his own haunted eyes staring back at him. He'd lost weight since the accident, his once fit frame now bordering on gaunt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, testament to the sleepless nights that had become his norm. Leading Blackwood Industries had proven to be more challenging than he'd ever anticipated. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he called, turning from the window. His assistant, Sarah, entered, a stack of papers in her arms. "The quarterly reports you asked for, Mr. Blackwood," she said, placing them on his desk. She hesitated, concern evident in her voice. "Is everything all right, sir? You look tired." Thomas managed a weak smile. "I'm fine, Sarah. Just a lot on my mind." He gestured to the papers. "How do they look?" Sarah's expression tightened. "Not great, I'm afraid. Profits are down 15% from last quarter, and we're seeing some concerning patterns in our international markets." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He'd been working tirelessly to keep the company afloat, but it felt like he was trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. Every time he solved one problem, two more seemed to appear. "Thank you, Sarah. That'll be all for now." As the door closed behind her, Thomas slumped into his chair. He opened the top drawer of his desk, pulling out a framed photo of himself and Michael at a company gala years ago. They were both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. It felt like a lifetime ago. I'm trying, Mike, he whispered to the photograph. I'm really trying. Just then, his phone buzzed with a notification. Thomas frowned as he read the message. Another emergency board meeting called for tomorrow morning. These were becoming more and more frequent, and each one felt like a tightening noose around his neck. As he prepared to leave for the day, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The company's struggles couldn't all be attributed to his inexperience or the natural upheaval following Michael's death. It was as if someone was actively working against him, but he couldn't figure out who or why. In the elevator ride down to the parking garage, Thomas's mind raced. He needed to get to the bottom of this before it was too late. Little did he know, the forces working against him were closer than he could have ever imagined, and the true test of his resolve was only just beginning. As he drove home through the bustling city streets, the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him. Thomas Blackwood, once known only as the younger brother of a business mogul, was now one of the most powerful men in the city. But with that power came a darkness he never expected, a creeping suspicion that threatened to consume him, and a guilt that gnawed at his soul with each passing day. The stage was set for a battle, not just for the future of Blackwood Industries, but for Thomas's very sanity. And as he pulled into his driveway, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. 3 months had passed since Thomas's realization that something was amiss within Blackwood Industries. The company's decline had accelerated at an alarming rate, and Thomas found himself trapped in a spiral of paranoia and suspicion. As he sat in yet another tense board meeting, Thomas couldn't help but scrutinize each face around the table. Who among them was the traitor? Who was leaking sensitive information to their competitors? Gentlemen, ladies, Thomas began, his voice strained. Our situation has become critical. We've lost 3 major contracts in the past month alone. Our stock price is plummeting. I need answers. The room fell silent. Thomas's gaze settled on James Hartley, the company's CFO and Michael's longtime friend. James, what's your take on this? James cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. It's difficult to say, Thomas. The market's been volatile, and with the recent setbacks... Setbacks? Thomas interrupted, his temper flaring. Is that what we're calling industrial espionage now? A murmur of unease rippled through the room. Victoria Chen, head of legal, spoke up. Mr. Blackwood, that's a serious accusation. Do you have any evidence? Thomas slumped back in his chair, suddenly aware of how he must sound. No, not yet. But I know something's not right. Someone in this room is working against us, and I intend to find out who. The meeting adjourned shortly after, with board members filing out in tense silence. As Thomas gathered his papers, he noticed James lingering behind. Thomas, James said softly, I know this is hard for you. Michael's shoes were big ones to fill, but you can't go around accusing people without proof. It's bad for morale, bad for the company. Thomas felt a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. I appreciate your concern, James, but I know what I'm doing. Later that evening, as Thomas pored over financial reports in his home office, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Parking garage, level B2, 11 p.m. Come alone if you want the truth. Thomas's heart raced. Was this the break he'd been waiting for? Or was he walking into a trap? After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his coat and car keys. The parking garage was eerily silent as Thomas descended to level B2. His footsteps echoed in the concrete structure, every shadow seeming to hide a potential threat. Hello? He called out, his voice bouncing off the walls. Mr. Blackwood. A figure stepped out from behind a pillar, a woman Thomas recognized as a mid-level accountant from the finance department. Karen, what's this about? Karen looked nervous, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. I've discovered something, sir. Discrepancies in the books. Large sums of money being moved around, covered up. I think someone's been embezzling funds for months. Thomas felt a mix of vindication and dread. Do you know who? Before Karen could answer, the screech of tires filled the air. A black SUV came barreling around the corner, heading straight for them. Thomas barely had time to shove Karen out of the way before diving to safety himself. The SUV sped off, leaving Thomas and Karen shaken but unharmed. As they picked themselves up, Thomas's mind reeled. This was no longer just about corporate espionage. Someone was willing to kill to keep their secrets. Karen, you need to get somewhere safe. Don't trust anyone, not even me. I'll handle this from here. As Thomas drove home, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he realized the gravity of his situation. The company he had inherited, the legacy he had sworn to protect, was crumbling around him. And now, it seemed, his very life was in danger. Little did Thomas know the true architect of his downfall was closer than he could have ever imagined, and the final act of this tragedy was about to unfold. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days for Thomas Blackwood. The attempted hit in the parking garage had shaken him to his core, and he found himself jumping at shadows, trusting no one. Despite his best efforts to salvage the situation, Blackwood Industries continued its downward spiral. Contracts were lost, investors pulled out, and the company's stock price plummeted to an all-time low. The board of directors grew increasingly restless, and Thomas could feel control slipping through his fingers. On a gloomy Monday morning, Thomas arrived at the office to find an unusual flurry of activity. As he stepped off the elevator, he was immediately confronted by Victoria Chen, the head of legal. Thomas, she said, her voice tight with tension, you need to come to the conference room right away. There's an emergency board meeting. Thomas's stomach dropped. What's going on, Victoria? She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. You'll see. Just come quickly. As Thomas entered the conference room, he was met with a sea of grim faces. At the head of the table sat a man he didn't recognize, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and a sharp suit. James Hartley stood up, looking uncomfortable. Thomas, this is Maxwell Rothschild, CEO of Rothschild Global Enterprises. Thomas felt his world tilt. Rothschild Global was one of their biggest competitors. What was its CEO doing here? Maxwell Rothschild stood, extending his hand. Mr. Blackwood, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. What circumstances? Thomas demanded, ignoring the outstretched hand. What's going on here? James cleared his throat. Thomas, the board has made a decision. Given the company's financial situation, we've agreed to a buyout offer from Rothschild Global. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. A buyout? Without consulting me? I'm the CEO, for God's sake! Victoria stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. Thomas, as per the company bylaws, in situations of extreme financial distress, the board has the authority to act without CEO approval if it's in the best interest of the shareholders. Thomas looked around the room, searching for a friendly face. An ally. He found none. This is insane. We can turn this around. We just need more time. Maxwell Rothschild spoke up. Mr. Blackwood, I assure you, this is the best outcome for everyone involved. Your employees will keep their jobs, your shareholders will recoup some of their losses, and the Blackwood name will live on as a subsidiary of Rothschild Global. Thomas felt the fight drain out of him. It was over. In the span of less than a year, he had inherited one of the city's most successful companies and driven it into the ground. The empire his father had built, that Michael had nurtured, was gone. As the details of the buyout were explained, Thomas barely listened. His mind was reeling, trying to comprehend how it had all gone so wrong. When the meeting finally adjourned, he found himself alone in the conference room, staring out at the city skyline that had once been his kingdom. James approached him cautiously. Thomas, I'm sorry it came to this. If there's anything I can do. Thomas turned, his eyes hollow. Just leave me alone, James, please. As the door closed behind James, Thomas slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He had failed the company, failed his employees, failed Michael's memory. The weight of his guilt, both for the company's downfall and the secret he carried about Michael's death, crushed down on him. In that moment, Thomas Blackwood, once the most powerful man in the city, felt utterly and completely broken. Little did he know, his journey through the darkness was far from over, and the most shocking revelation was yet to come. In the weeks following the buyout of Blackwood Industries, Thomas Blackwood's life unraveled at an alarming pace. The man who once commanded boardrooms and shaped industries now found himself adrift, haunted by failure and consumed by guilt. His spacious penthouse, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a prison. Empty bottles littered the floors, testament to his attempts to numb the pain. The vibrant, driven entrepreneur had been replaced by a shell of a man, unshaven and disheveled. On a particularly bleak afternoon, Thomas sat in his darkened living room, staring at the city skyline he once dominated. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from concerned friends, former colleagues, even reporters seeking comments on his spectacular fall from grace. He ignored them all. A knock at the door startled him from his stupor. Reluctantly, he shuffled to answer it, finding his former assistant, Sarah, standing there with worry etched on her face. "Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, taking in his haggard appearance. "I've been trying to reach you for days. I'm worried about you." Thomas managed a bitter laugh. "Worried? About the man who destroyed a century-old company in less than a year? Don't waste your energy, Sarah." Despite his protests, Sarah insisted on coming in. She opened curtains, cleared away bottles, and eventually coaxed Thomas into sitting at the kitchen table while she made coffee. "You need help, Mr. Blackwood," she said, placing a steaming mug in front of him. "Have you considered talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" Thomas stared into the dark liquid, seeing his distorted reflection. "A therapist can't fix what I've done, Sarah. The company, the employees who lost their jobs. Michael?" His voice broke on his brother's name, and Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Michael's death wasn't your fault. It was an accident." If only she knew, Thomas thought, the guilt churning in his stomach. In the days that followed, at Sarah's insistence, Thomas reluctantly began seeing a therapist. But as he sat in the plush office, surrounded by degrees and certifications, he found himself unable to speak the truth. How could he explain the depth of his failure, the weight of his secrets? The sessions left him feeling more alone than ever. The therapist's well-meaning platitudes about moving forward and finding new purpose rang hollow in the face of his overwhelming guilt and despair. One night, after a particularly difficult therapy session, Thomas found himself standing on the terrace of his penthouse, looking down at the city streets far below. The cool night air whipped around him, and for a moment he felt a strange sense of peace. One step, he thought. One step and it would all be over. No more guilt, no more failure, no more sleepless nights reliving every mistake. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and lifted his foot. "Thomas, don't!" The voice, achingly familiar, froze him in place. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Slowly, Thomas turned around, his heart pounding in his chest. There, standing in the doorway to the terrace, was a face he never thought he'd see again. Michael. His brother, alive and whole, stared at him with a mix of fear and something else. Was it regret? "Mike," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "How? You're dead. I saw you die." Michael took a cautious step forward, his hands raised as if approaching a wounded animal. "I survived the crash, Thomas, and I think it's time we both face the truth about what really happened that night." As the implications of Michael's words sank in, Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. The reality he had been living in for the past year shattered, leaving him standing on the edge, literally and figuratively, of a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Thomas staggered back from the edge of the terrace, his mind reeling. Michael, his brother, the man he thought he had killed, stood before him, very much alive. "This isn't possible," Thomas muttered, shaking his head. "I'm hallucinating. The guilt, the stress, it's finally broken me." Michael stepped forward, his face etched with concern and something deeper, remorse. "You're not hallucinating, Tom. I'm really here." As if to prove his point, Michael reached out and grasped Thomas's arm. The touch was solid, real. Thomas flinched at the contact, overwhelmed by the conflicting emotions surging through him, relief, confusion, and a gnawing dread. "How?" Thomas managed to choke out. "I saw you. The car." Michael sighed heavily, guiding his shocked brother back into the penthouse. They sat on the couch, the cityscape twinkling behind them through the terrace doors, oblivious to the drama unfolding within. "I was thrown from the car during the crash," Michael began, his voice low and measured. "By some miracle, I landed in a cluster of trees. I was injured, but alive. When I came to, I dragged myself to a nearby cabin. The old man living there helped me, kept me hidden while I recovered." Thomas listened, his mind struggling to process this information. "But why? Why didn't you come back? Let us know you were alive?" Michael's eyes hardened. "Because when I finally made it back to the city, ready to return home, I saw something that changed everything." A chill ran down Thomas's spine. He knew, somehow, what was coming next. "I saw you, Thomas. At home, surrounded by lawyers and accountants. You were laughing, celebrating my death." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with accusation. Thomas felt the weight of his guilt pressing down on him, threatening to crush him. Mike, he began, but Michael cut him off. I knew then that the crash wasn't an accident. You had tried to kill me, hadn't you, Thomas? The question was rhetorical. They both knew the truth. Thomas's silence was answer enough. So I decided, Michael continued, his voice tight with suppressed emotion, that if you wanted Blackwood Industries so badly, you'd kill your own brother for it. Then you should have it. All of it. The power, the responsibility, the pressure. I wanted you to feel the weight of it all. Realization dawned on Thomas, bringing with it a fresh wave of horror. It was you. All along, it was you working against the company. The leaked information, the lost contracts. Michael nodded grimly. I used my connections, my knowledge of the company's inner workings. It was surprisingly easy to orchestrate your downfall from the shadows. Thomas felt sick. The past year of paranoia, stress, and failure. All of it orchestrated by his own brother. The brother he had tried to murder. Why come forward now? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael's expression softened slightly. Because despite everything, you're still my brother. When I saw you on that terrace just now, about to jump, I realized this had gone too far. We've both gone too far. The brothers sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their shared history and mutual betrayals hanging between them. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. I'm sorry, Mike. God, I'm so sorry. For everything. Michael nodded slowly. I'm sorry too, Tom, for letting my anger and hurt drive me to destroy everything we both worked for. As the first light of dawn began to creep into the sky, casting a soft glow over the city, the Blackwood brothers faced each other. Two men, broken by ambition, jealousy, and revenge, but bound by blood and a shared history that couldn't be erased. Where do we go from here? Thomas asked, feeling for the first time in months a tiny flicker of hope. Michael looked out at the awakening city. I don't know, but maybe we start by forgiving each other and ourselves. As they sat there, the sun rising on a new day, Thomas and Michael Blackwood took the first tentative steps towards redemption, reconciliation, and the long, difficult process of rebuilding, not just their company, but their relationship as brothers. 6 months had passed since the night of revelations on Thomas Blackwood's terrace. The city bustled with its usual energy, but for the Blackwood brothers, everything had changed. Thomas and Michael sat in a small, modest office, a far cry from the opulent boardroom of Blackwood Tower. Between them on the desk lay a business plan, their plan for a new start. Are you sure about this, Mike? Thomas asked, tapping the document. Starting over from scratch. It won't be easy. Michael nodded, a determined glint in his eye. We built Blackwood Industries once. We can do it again, only this time we do it together. The brothers had spent months rebuilding their relationship, attending therapy both individually and together. They had faced their demons, confronted their mistakes, and slowly, painfully, forged a new understanding. Their new venture was small, a boutique consulting firm specializing in corporate turnarounds. It was ironic, given their own spectacular fall, but who better to guide struggling companies than those who had experienced rock bottom themselves? As they finalized the details of their plan, a knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah, Thomas's former assistant, and now their office manager, poked her head in. Your next client is here, she announced with a smile. Thomas and Michael exchanged a look. This was it, their first real test as partners. As they stood to greet their client, Thomas felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. The Blackwood brothers had fallen from the heights of success, destroyed each other and themselves in the process, but had found something more valuable in the ruins: true brotherhood and a chance at redemption. As they welcomed their client, ready to help another struggling business find its way, Thomas and Michael knew that their greatest success story was yet to be written. Not in profit margins or stock prices, but in the strength of their rekindled bond as brothers.